The slap echoed through the upscale Atlanta mall like a gunshot, and Marcus Williams felt every eye in the food court turn toward him as the well-dressed white woman's hand connected with his face. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt as security guards rushed toward them. "I know exactly what you are, trying to scam people in a place like this. Someone call the police." Marcus stood frozen, his cheek burning, not from the physical pain, but from the familiar sting of humiliation he thought he'd left behind 20 years ago. The shopping bags at his feet spilled open, revealing the expensive gifts he'd been carrying, and the woman pointed at them with a manicured finger. "He probably stole those," she announced loudly to the growing crowd. "I saw him lurking around the jewelry store acting suspicious." The security guards grabbed Marcus by both arms, their grip unnecessarily tight, and he didn't resist because he'd learned long ago that resistance only made things worse for someone who looked like him. What this woman didn't know, what none of these people gawking and recording on their phones could possibly understand, was that Marcus Williams wasn't just anyone, and the mistake she just made would cost her everything she held dear. The head of security, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut and a permanent scowl, pushed Marcus toward the mall office while the woman followed behind, her heels clicking against the tile floor like a countdown to judgment. "I want him arrested," she demanded, her voice shrill and entitled. "He bumped into me deliberately, and when I confronted him, he had the audacity to tell me to watch where I was going." Marcus kept his mouth shut, his jaw clenched so tight he could feel his teeth grinding together, because what was the point of explaining that she had been the one texting while walking, that she had crashed into him and sent his bags flying, that he had simply suggested she pay attention to her surroundings? In the security office, they made him empty his pockets, spread his purchases on the table, and produce receipts for every single item while the woman stood there with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk on her face. "I'm Rebecca Hartwell," she announced, as if her name should mean something. "My husband is James Hartwell, senior partner at Hartwell and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in Georgia. And if you don't arrest this man right now, I'll make sure this mall faces a lawsuit for allowing criminals to harass paying customers." Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, each word measured and controlled. "I have receipts for everything. I haven't stolen anything, and I didn't bump into you on purpose." The security guard barely glanced at the receipts, more interested in Rebecca's threats than Marcus's evidence, and that's when Marcus saw it, that familiar look in their eyes that told him this wasn't about stolen merchandise or an accidental collision. This was about something deeper, something uglier, something he'd been fighting his entire life. Rebecca leaned forward, her perfume overwhelming in the small office, and her eyes narrowed as she studied Marcus's face. "You look familiar," she said slowly, suspicion creeping into her tone. "Have you worked at my house? Were you one of the gardeners or maintenance people?" The assumption hung in the air like poison gas, and Marcus felt something inside him shift, a door he'd kept carefully locked beginning to crack open. He could tell them who he really was, could end this humiliation with a single sentence, but part of him wanted to see how far they would take it, wanted to witness firsthand the ugly truth he'd been shielding his daughters from their entire lives. The police arrived within minutes, two officers who seemed to have already made up their minds before they even heard the story, and Marcus watched as Rebecca performed for them, her voice trembling with fake emotion as she described how threatened she'd felt, how aggressive Marcus had been, how certain she was that those expensive items couldn't possibly belong to someone like him. "Someone like me," Marcus repeated softly, and one of the officers told him to be quiet, to keep his hands where they could see them, to stop being difficult. They ran his ID, probably hoping for warrants or prior arrests, and Marcus could see the confusion on their faces when his record came back completely clean, not even a parking ticket. "Mr. Williams," the older officer said slowly, reading from his computer screen with a frown. "It says here you live in Buckhead." Buckhead, one of Atlanta's most affluent neighborhoods, and Marcus saw the officers exchange glances, their certainty wavering slightly but not enough to overcome their initial assumptions. Rebecca wasn't deterred. "He probably works there," she said dismissively. "Or he put down a fake address." What none of them knew was that Marcus Williams owned his home in Buckhead outright, a four-bedroom colonial with a swimming pool and a view of the city skyline, paid for with money he'd earned through decades of hard work and sacrifice. What they couldn't see was the framed photos on his mantle showing two beautiful twin girls growing up year by year, from tiny premature babies in an incubator to gap-toothed children to elegant teenagers to accomplished young women. What they would never understand unless he chose to tell them was the journey that had started 20 years ago when Marcus, then a 35-year-old single man working double shifts as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital, had made a decision that everyone told him was crazy, impossible, and doomed to fail. But Marcus didn't speak, didn't defend himself, didn't pull out his phone to call the people who could end this charade in seconds, because sometimes the world needed to reveal its true face, even when that face was ugly enough to break your heart. 20 years earlier, Marcus had been standing in a different kind of sterile room, looking through a window at two tiny babies who weren't supposed to survive the night. They'd been born at 26 weeks to a teenage mother who died from complications during delivery, too young and too scared to have told anyone she was pregnant until it was far too late. The babies weighed less than 2 pounds each, their skin translucent, their lungs struggling with every breath, and Marcus had been assigned to their care during his shift in the neonatal intensive care unit. He'd fallen in love with them immediately, these tiny fighters who refused to give up, who grew stronger each day against all medical odds, who seemed to recognize his voice when he talked to them during their tube feedings and vital checks. The social worker had told him not to get attached, that these babies would go into the foster system as soon as they were stable enough to leave the hospital, that there was already a list of families waiting to adopt healthy white infants. But these babies weren't healthy yet, and their mixed-race heritage made them less desirable to the couples looking for perfect additions to their perfect families. And Marcus couldn't stomach the idea of these fighters being separated or ending up in a system that might not fight for them the way they'd fought to survive. He'd asked the social worker what it would take for him to adopt them, and she'd laughed, actually laughed right in his face, before realizing he was serious. "Mr. Williams," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you're a single man, you work 60-hour weeks, you live in a one-bedroom apartment, and frankly, the system isn't set up to place infant girls with unmarried men, especially not special needs infants who will require round-the-clock care for months or possibly years." She ticked off each obstacle on her fingers like she was reading a grocery list, but Marcus had already made up his mind, had already started researching adoption laws and reaching out to lawyers and reorganizing his entire life around two babies who didn't even know he existed. The hospital's social worker had tried to dissuade him. His own family had called him foolish. His friends had suggested he was having some kind of early midlife crisis, and the adoption agency had put every possible barrier in his path. They'd questioned his motives, implied inappropriate things, made him jump through hoops that married couples never had to clear, subjected him to home visits and psychological evaluations and background checks so thorough they probably knew what he'd eaten for breakfast in 3rd grade. But Marcus had persisted, had moved to a larger apartment, had cut his hours at the hospital and picked up consulting work he could do from home, had taken parenting classes and infant CPR and special needs training. He'd spent every spare moment at the hospital with the twins, whom he'd already started calling Emma and Olivia in his mind, names that meant universal and peace, because he wanted them to know they belonged everywhere and that they were his tranquility in a chaotic world. The nurses had started letting him help with their care, showing him how to change their tiny diapers and position them for feeding and monitor their oxygen levels. And Marcus had documented everything, had created binders full of medical records and care schedules and developmental milestones. 6 months later, after more legal battles than he'd thought possible, After judgmental questions from social workers who couldn't understand why a successful, educated black man would choose this particular path to fatherhood. After draining most of his savings on lawyer fees and home modifications, Marcus Williams had walked out of a courthouse with two baby girls who were finally, legally, his daughters. The judgment had started immediately. Whispers in grocery stores when he struggled with a double stroller and shopping cart. Suspicious glances at the pediatrician's office when he was the only father in a waiting room full of mothers. Outright hostility from other parents at the playground who pulled their children away when he tried to socialize. People assumed he was a babysitter or a kidnapper, anything but a father, and Marcus had lost count of how many times he'd been stopped by concerned citizens who demanded to know where the girls' real parents were. The school years had been even worse, constant questions about why there was no mother listed on emergency contact forms, invasive inquiries about his relationship status, thinly veiled suggestions that girls needed a female role model, and maybe the twins would be better off in a more traditional family structure. Marcus had endured it all with quiet dignity, had showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every dance recital, every soccer game, had braided hair and bought first training bras and explained menstruation with the help of books and videos, and his female colleagues at the hospital. He'd been room parent and PTA volunteer, and the dad who always brought the best snacks. And slowly, grudgingly, some people had started to accept that maybe this unconventional family could actually work. But acceptance was fragile, and Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way when Emma and Olivia were 10 years old, and a new neighbor had called Child Protective Services with concerns about two young girls living alone with an adult male who wasn't their biological father. The investigation had been humiliating, strangers going through their home, interviewing the girls at school without Marcus present, treating him like a predator instead of a parent who'd sacrificed everything for his children. The case had been closed quickly when investigators found a loving, stable home and two well-adjusted daughters who clearly adored their father, but the damage had been done. Emma had cried herself to sleep for weeks, terrified that someone was going to take her away from the only parent she'd ever known, and Olivia had become withdrawn and anxious, her grades slipping as she worried about whether their family was legal enough, normal enough, good enough. Marcus had held them both and promised that nothing would separate them, that they were his daughters in every way that mattered, that blood didn't make a family but love did, and he had enough love for 1,000 families. He'd poured everything into those girls, every dollar, every moment of free time, every ounce of energy he possessed. When they'd shown interest in music, he'd bought a piano they couldn't afford and worked extra shifts to pay for lessons. When Olivia had discovered a love for science, Marcus had converted their garage into a makeshift laboratory and spent weekends helping her with experiments that sometimes went spectacularly wrong. When Emma had wanted to learn ballet, Marcus had been the only father in a studio full of mothers, sitting through classes and sewing costumes and learning how to properly secure a bun because his daughter deserved to have a parent who showed up completely. People had watched him struggle, had offered advice but rarely help, had whispered about how much easier it would be if he just found a wife, as if his daughters needed a woman more than they needed him. But Marcus had never wavered, had never made the girls feel like they were a burden or a sacrifice, had instead shown them through action every single day that they were his greatest joy, his proudest accomplishment, his whole entire world. The twins had thrived in ways that surprised everyone except Marcus, who'd never doubted them for a second. They'd gone to a good public high school where Emma had been class president and captain of the debate team, while Olivia had won state science competitions and published research in actual academic journals while still a teenager. Marcus had watched other parents compete and push their children toward burnout, had listened to them brag about SAT scores and college acceptance letters, and he'd quietly encouraged his daughters to pursue what made them happy rather than what would look good on an application. When college decision time came, the twins had options: full-ride scholarships to prestigious universities, and Marcus had cried proud tears as he'd helped them pack for separate schools. Emma heading to Harvard Law School and Olivia accepting a spot at Johns Hopkins for medical school. The nest had emptied all at once, and Marcus had walked through his too-quiet house wondering if he'd done enough, prepared them adequately, loved them sufficiently to face a world that would judge them for their mixed heritage, their unconventional family, their bold aspirations. He needn't have worried, because Emma and Olivia had taken the world by storm in ways even Marcus hadn't anticipated. Emma had graduated top of her class at Harvard and had been recruited by multiple prestigious firms before deciding to focus on civil rights law, taking cases other attorneys wouldn't touch, defending people who reminded her of her father and the discrimination he'd faced. Olivia had blazed through medical school and a surgical residency, specializing in neonatal surgery, saving babies like she herself had once been saved, giving desperate parents the same hope that had carried Marcus through those early terrifying months. They'd both made names for themselves by age 30, Emma winning landmark cases that changed policy, and Olivia pioneering surgical techniques that improved survival rates for premature infants. But they'd stayed humble, calling Marcus every week, visiting whenever they could, crediting him publicly and privately for everything they'd achieved, telling anyone who would listen about the single dad who'd fought the world to give them a chance at life. Now, in this mall security office, Marcus Williams sat quietly while people who knew nothing about him, about his life, about his daughters, about his character, tried to determine his guilt or innocence based on nothing more than the color of his skin and their own prejudices. The older police officer was on his phone now, speaking in low tones, and Marcus could tell something had shifted. Some piece of information had been uncovered that was changing the narrative. Rebecca Hartwell was still complaining, still demanding action, still certain of her righteousness, and Marcus almost felt sorry for her because she had no idea what was coming. The officer ended his call and looked at Marcus with new eyes, confusion and maybe embarrassment flickering across his features. "Mr. Williams," he said carefully, "I just spoke with my supervisor, and there seems to be some confusion here. Are you the Marcus Williams who serves on the board of Grady Memorial Hospital?" Marcus nodded slowly, watching realization dawn on faces around the room. "And the same Marcus Williams who was honored by the governor last year for your work in healthcare accessibility." The security guard suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor, and Rebecca's confident expression finally started to crack, uncertainty creeping in around the edges. But Marcus wasn't done letting them sit in the discomfort they'd created, wasn't ready to let them off the hook quite yet, because this moment was about more than his bruised ego or wasted afternoon. This was about every black parent who'd been accused of kidnapping their own children, every single father who'd been treated like a threat instead of a caregiver, every person who'd been judged by their appearance rather than their character. "Yes," Marcus said quietly. "I'm also the Marcus Williams whose daughter Emma is currently serving as lead counsel in the discrimination lawsuit against Hartwell and Associates." The color drained from Rebecca's face so fast Marcus thought she might faint, and he continued, his voice still calm but carrying the weight of 20 years of silent endurance. "The same firm where your husband is senior partner, Mrs. Hartwell. Small world, isn't it?" Rebecca stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist, and Marcus could see her mind racing, calculating the damage she'd just done. "I didn't know," she whispered, but Marcus held up a hand to stop her because she'd missed the point entirely. "You didn't know who I was," he agreed. "But that shouldn't have mattered. You assaulted me, accused me of theft, and used your privilege to try and have me arrested, all because I suggested you watch where you were walking. You did all of that not knowing anything about me except what you assumed based on how I look." The officers were backing away now, probably worried about their own liability, and the security guard was apologizing profusely, but Marcus ignored them all, his attention focused on Rebecca. "My other daughter, Olivia, is a neonatal surgeon at Emory University Hospital. Last week, She saved the life of a baby born at 24 weeks. That baby's mother was a white teenager from Alpharetta who'd hidden her pregnancy out of fear and shame. Olivia didn't ask about the mother's race or background or insurance. She just did her job and saved that baby because that's what doctors do. That's what good people do. Marcus stood slowly, gathering his receipted purchases and his dignity, and every person in that room seemed frozen, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm not going to press charges," he said, and he could see the relief flood Rebecca's face before he added, "But I am going to tell my daughters what happened here today, and I'm going to let them decide how they want to proceed." He walked toward the door, and the officers stepped aside quickly, no longer interested in detaining him. "Mr. Williams," Rebecca called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. My husband's firm, his reputation, we can't afford. Please." Marcus turned back to look at her, this woman who minutes ago had felt so powerful and righteous, now reduced to begging, and he felt that familiar exhaustion that came from having to be the bigger person, from having to show grace to people who'd shown him none. 20 years ago," he said softly, "I adopted 2 baby girls that nobody wanted. I was told I wasn't qualified, wasn't suitable, wasn't the right fit. People judged me then just like you judged me today, based on assumptions and prejudices and fear." He paused, letting his words sink in, watching Rebecca's face crumble as she began to understand the magnitude of what she'd done. Those girls grew up hearing whispers, facing discrimination, dealing with people who looked at our family and saw something wrong instead of something beautiful. I taught them to respond to hate with excellence, to answer ignorance with education, to meet cruelty with compassion. Marcus took a breath, thinking about Emma and Olivia, about the strong, brilliant, kind women they'd become despite the obstacles the world had thrown at them. "But I also taught them to stand up for themselves, to demand respect, to never let anyone diminish their worth or their father's worth. So while I'm choosing to walk away right now, to let this moment be a learning experience rather than a legal battle, I can't make that choice for them. They're grown women with their own voices, their own power, and their own sense of justice."
Marcus left the mall with his head high, aware of the phone still recording, the whispers following him, the social media posts probably already going viral, and for once he didn't care about the attention because he told his truth and stood his ground. He drove home through Atlanta traffic, his mind drifting between the humiliation of the afternoon and the pride he felt in the women his daughters had become. When he pulled into his driveway in Buckhead, the house that had once seemed too big for a single dad and 2 tiny babies now felt perfectly sized for the life he'd built. Inside, surrounded by photos and memories and evidence of 20 years of unconditional love, Marcus finally pulled out his phone and called Emma. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright with joy. "Dad, I was just about to call you. You'll never guess what happened today." Marcus smiled despite everything. "Tell me," he said, settling into his favorite chair, the one he'd rocked 2 fussy babies in during countless sleepless nights. Emma's words tumbled out in an excited rush. "The Hartwell case, the discrimination lawsuit I've been working on for 8 months, we finally got the evidence we needed. James Hartwell himself has been systematically passing over qualified minority candidates for promotion while advancing less qualified white associates. We have emails, we have testimony from 17 different employees, we have him dead to rights." She paused for breath, and Marcus could hear the fierce determination in her voice, the same determination he'd seen when she was 5 years old and decided to learn to ride a bike in a single afternoon. "We're going to take that firm apart, Dad. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." Marcus listened to his daughter, this warrior for justice, and felt his heart swell with pride. "That's amazing, sweetheart," he said. "You're going to change lives." Emma laughed. "I learned from the best." "You changed mine." After he hung up with Emma, Marcus sat in the growing darkness, not bothering to turn on lights, just existing in the peace of his home and his memories. His phone buzzed with a call from Olivia, and he answered to hear her exhausted but happy voice. "Dad, I'm sorry I haven't called this week. We had 3 emergency surgeries, one right after another, and I've barely slept." Marcus could hear the fatigue in her words, but also the satisfaction, the same feeling he used to get after a successful shift saving lives. "I'm proud of you, Liv," he said simply. "How are the babies?" Olivia updated him on her tiny patients, and Marcus closed his eyes, remembering when she and Emma had been those tiny patients, when every breath had been uncertain, every day a victory. "Dad," Olivia said suddenly, "is something wrong? You sound off." Marcus hesitated, then decided his daughters deserved to know the truth, deserved to make their own choices about how to respond. He told them both on a three-way call about what had happened at the mall, and he could hear their anger building, their voices rising with righteous fury. "She hit you," Emma practically shouted. "She assaulted you and tried to have you arrested. Dad, we're pressing charges. I'm calling the district attorney right now." But Marcus calmed them down, reminded them of the lessons he taught them about choosing their battles, about the difference between revenge and justice. "I don't want you to do anything out of anger," he said firmly. "If you take action, do it because it's right, not because you're upset on my behalf." There was silence on the line, and then Olivia spoke, her voice quiet but steel-edged. "Dad, remember when I was 12 and that woman at the grocery store accused you of kidnapping us?" Marcus remembered his sweet daughter's confused tears, remembered having to explain to her why some people saw danger instead of family. "You told us that day that sometimes the world needs to be educated, that silence can be complicity, that we had a responsibility to speak up for people who couldn't speak for themselves." Emma jumped in, her lawyer voice activated. "Rebecca Hartwell is married to a man I'm currently suing for systemic discrimination. This isn't a coincidence, Dad. This is a pattern. These are people who genuinely believe they're superior, who act with impunity because they've never faced consequences." Marcus listened to his daughters, these incredible women he'd raised, and realized they were right. This wasn't about him or his hurt feelings. This was about every person who'd face Rebecca Hartwell in the future, every black parent she'd view with suspicion, every person of color she'd treat as less than because of her unchecked prejudices. "What do you want to do?" he asked, trusting them completely. Emma's response was immediate. "I want to add her assault to the civil case against the firm, show a pattern of behavior and attitude that starts at the top and extends to the partners' families. And I want you to press criminal charges so there's a public record." Olivia agreed. "And I want to write an op-ed for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution about being raised by a single black father in a world that constantly questioned whether he was qualified to parent us. I want people to understand what you sacrificed, what we gained, and what we all lose when we judge families that don't fit traditional molds." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes, overwhelmed by these women, by their strength and conviction and love. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This will open up our lives to scrutiny. People will dig into our past, our story. It won't be easy." Both his daughters laughed, the sound so familiar and beloved that Marcus felt warmth spread through his chest. "Dad," Emma said gently, "you raised us to be strong. You taught us that easy isn't the same as right. When have we ever chosen easy?" Olivia added, "Besides, we're not ashamed of our story. We're proud of it. We're proud of you." The next week moved like a whirlwind, events cascading faster than Marcus could track. Emma filed an amended lawsuit that included Rebecca Hartwell's assault and the pattern of discrimination it revealed, and the local news picked up the story because one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms being sued by the daughter of the man whose wife had assaulted was too juicy to ignore. Olivia's op-ed ran on the front page of the Sunday paper, a beautifully written piece about growing up in an unconventional family and the single father who defied every odd to give two premature, mixed-race baby girls a chance at life. The story went viral, shared millions of times across social media, with other children of single fathers adding their own stories, and adoption advocates praising Marcus for breaking barriers. Interview requests poured in from local news, from national morning shows, from podcasts and magazines and documentary filmmakers, everyone wanting to know more about Marcus Williams and the daughters he'd raised. Marcus agreed to one interview, a sit-down with a respected Atlanta journalist, and he brought Emma and Olivia with him because this was their story too. They sat together on a couch, these three people who'd become a family against all odds, and Marcus watched with pride as his daughters spoke eloquently about their childhood, their father's sacrifices, and the discrimination they'd all faced. "People see a single black man with two little girls and they assume the worst," Emma explained to the interviewer. "They don't see a father who learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos at 2 in the morning. They don't see a parent who attended every school event, who volunteered for every field trip, who worked himself to exhaustion to provide opportunities we might not have had otherwise." Olivia added, "Our dad taught us that family isn't about biology or race or traditional structures. Family is about showing up, about sacrifice, about unconditional love. He showed up for us every single day for 20 years, and he's still showing up." The interviewer asked Marcus how he found the strength to persist when facing so much judgment, and Marcus thought carefully before answering. "I looked at those two tiny babies in the hospital," he said slowly, "and I saw potential. I saw fighters. I saw children who deserved a chance. Nothing anyone said about my qualifications or my marital status or my gender mattered more than giving Emma and Olivia the life they deserved." He looked at his daughters sitting on either side of him, successful and strong and everything he'd hoped they'd become. "Every parent faces doubt and fear. I just faced it with an audience of critics. But the only opinions that ever mattered to me were theirs, and as long as my daughters knew they were loved, wanted, and valued, I could handle anything the world threw at us." The fallout for the Hartwells was swift and severe. Rebecca's assault was caught on multiple cell phone videos that had been posted online, and watching a well-dressed white woman slap a black man and then falsely accuse him of theft was damning in the court of public opinion. Several major clients pulled their business from Hartwell and Associates, not wanting to be associated with a firm facing discrimination lawsuits and viral videos of partner spouses committing assault. James Hartwell was forced to step down as senior partner while the case proceeded, and Rebecca issued a public apology that felt hollow and scripted, more concerned with damage control than genuine remorse. But Marcus didn't take satisfaction in their downfall because revenge had never been his motivation. Justice was what mattered, and justice meant making sure this didn't happen to the next person, the next family, the next single father who dared to love children who needed him. 3 months after the mall incident, Emma won her case against Hartwell and Associates in a settlement that included substantial damages for her clients, mandatory diversity training for all employees, and the implementation of transparent promotion processes with third-party oversight. She stood on the courthouse steps giving a statement to the press, and Marcus watched from the crowd, anonymous among the reporters and spectators, content to let his daughter have her moment. She was magnificent, articulate, and passionate, talking about systemic change and accountability, and Marcus thought about the tiny baby who'd fought to breathe, who'd grown into this powerful force for good. When Emma finished her statement, she scanned the crowd until she found her father's face, and she smiled, that same gap-toothed grin she'd had as a 6-year-old, and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Marcus smiled back, shaking his head slightly because she had it backward. He should be thanking her, thanking both his daughters for justifying every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. That evening, Marcus hosted a quiet dinner at his home in Buckhead, just him and Emma and Olivia, the way it had been for so many years when it was just the three of them against the world. They cooked together in the kitchen that had seen 1,000 meals, laughing and talking and moving around each other with the ease of people who knew each other's rhythms perfectly. Over pasta and salad, Emma raised her glass. "To Dad," she said simply, "for never giving up on us even when everyone said he should." Olivia raised her glass too, for teaching us that love makes a family and that family is worth fighting for. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, overwhelmed by gratitude for these women, for this life, for the decision he'd made 20 years ago to fight for 2 babies nobody else wanted. "To my daughters," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "for making every single struggle worth it, for being kind and brilliant and strong, for making me proud every day of my life." After dinner, they sat in the living room where Marcus had once rocked 2 crying infants, where he'd helped with homework and hosted sleepovers and celebrated birthdays, and Emma pulled out a folder she'd been carrying. "Dad," she said, suddenly nervous, "Liv and I have been working on something and we wanted to share it with you." She handed him the folder, and Marcus opened it to find documents for a foundation, the Marcus Williams Foundation for Single-Parent Adoptions, designed to provide financial assistance, legal support, and resources for single people wanting to adopt children, particularly those in the foster system or with special needs. "We've already secured initial funding," Olivia explained. "Between our savings and some donations from people inspired by your story, we have enough to help at least 50 families in the first year." Marcus stared at the documents, vision blurring with tears he didn't try to hide. "You did this," he whispered, "for me." Emma moved to sit beside him, taking his hand. "Not for you, Dad, because of you. You showed us that one person willing to fight can change lives. You changed ours, and now we want to help you change others." Olivia sat on his other side, completing their circle. "How many babies are out there right now like we were? How many kids are waiting for someone to choose them? How many potential parents are being told they're not qualified because they don't fit some outdated ideal?" Marcus looked at his daughters, these miraculous women, and felt the weight of 2 decades of struggle lift from his shoulders. He'd spent 20 years wondering if he'd done enough, been enough, given enough, and here was his answer in the form of 2 incredible humans who wanted to multiply his impact exponentially. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. Emma smiled. "You don't have to say anything. You taught us through action, not words. Now we're doing the same." 6 months later, the Marcus Williams Foundation held its first event, a fundraising gala at a fancy Atlanta hotel, and Marcus stood uncomfortably in a tuxedo while hundreds of people mingled and bid on auction items. Emma and Olivia had insisted he attend, had insisted he be honored publicly, and while Marcus would have preferred to stay home, he understood this night wasn't really about him. It was about the families they'd help, the children who'd find homes, the single parents who'd no longer have to fight alone. During the program, Olivia took the stage to introduce her father, and Marcus listened as she told their story to a room full of strangers, her voice strong and clear as she described the man who defied convention to become her parent. "My father could have walked past our incubator and continued with his life," she said. "We were someone else's responsibility, someone else's problem. But he saw 2 lives worth fighting for, and he fought. Against bureaucracy, against prejudice, against a system designed to reject him. He fought and he won, and 20 years later, he's still fighting, still showing up, still proving that love is the only qualification that matters when it comes to being a parent." When Marcus finally took the stage, he kept his remarks brief because speeches had never been his strength. 20 years ago, he said, looking out at the crowd, "I made a choice that everyone told me was wrong. I was too single, too male, too unprepared, too optimistic about my ability to parent 2 medically fragile infants." He paused, finding Emma and Olivia in the crowd, their faces shining with love and pride. But those 2 babies didn't need perfect parents. They needed committed parents. They needed someone who would show up every day, who would learn and adapt and sacrifice. They needed love, and I had plenty of that to give. He gripped the podium, thinking about all the families they would help through this foundation, all the children who would find homes, all the lives that would be changed. If this foundation helps even one person who's been told they're not qualified to adopt a child who needs them, if it removes even one barrier between children and loving homes, then every struggle of the past 20 years will have had purpose beyond my own family.
The gala raised over $2 million, and within a year, the foundation had helped 63 families complete adoptions, had provided legal assistance to single parents facing discrimination, and had successfully lobbied for changes in adoption laws that removed some of the barriers Marcus had faced. Emma continued her civil rights work, taking on cases that challenged systemic discrimination, and she was rumored to be considering a run for political office. Olivia's research on neonatal care was published in major medical journals, and she was invited to speak at conferences around the world, sharing techniques that were saving babies in hospitals from Atlanta to Australia. Both women credited their father publicly and privately for their success, never letting an interview or speech pass without mentioning the single dad who'd raised them. And Marcus had stopped trying to deflect the attention because he'd finally understood that their pride in him was as important as his pride in them. 5 years after the mall incident, Marcus retired from his position at Grady Memorial Hospital after 4 decades of nursing, and the hospital held a ceremony honoring his service. Colleagues told stories about his compassion, his skill, his dedication to patients who had no one else to advocate for them. But the most touching moment came when a young woman approached the microphone, holding a baby. 24 years ago, she said, her voice shaking with emotion, I gave birth to twin daughters and died on the delivery table. Obviously, I didn't stay dead, and I've spent the last 2 decades getting my life together. Marcus leaned forward, studying the woman's face, and felt recognition dawn. She looked different, older obviously, healthier, but the bone structure was familiar. My daughters were adopted by a nurse who worked in the NICU, she continued. I was told they went to a good home, but I didn't know any details until recently when I saw Dr. Olivia Williams on the news talking about premature infant care. The woman's tears fell freely now. I saw her face and I just knew she was one of my babies. I did some research and found out about her sister Emma, about their father Marcus, about the incredible family they became. She looked directly at Marcus, gratitude shining in her eyes. I'm not here to disrupt their lives or claim any parental rights. They have a father, a real father who earned that title every single day. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for seeing value in 2 babies the world had written off. Thank you for giving them a life I never could have provided. Thank you for raising them to be women who make the world better. She held up her baby. I'm 24 years clean and sober now, married, and this is my son. I got to keep this one, got to raise him, because your daughter's story inspired me to believe I could be a better person. So thank you, Mr. Williams, for saving more lives than you'll ever know. Marcus embraced the woman, this stranger who'd given him the greatest gifts of his life, and he whispered his own thank you for 2 daughters who'd filled his world with purpose and joy. Later, at home, he sat with Emma and Olivia and told them about the woman, about her gratitude and her recovery, and they cried together, these 3 people bound by choice rather than biology. Do you want to meet her? Marcus asked, giving them the option. She doesn't want to intrude, but she's open to contact if you're interested. The twins looked at each other with that silent communication they'd always shared, and Olivia spoke first. Maybe someday, she said thoughtfully. I'm glad she's doing well, and I appreciate that she gave birth to us, but you're our parent, Dad. You're the one who counts. Emma nodded agreement. Biology is just genetics. You're our father in every way that matters. On Father's Day that year, Marcus received a card from Emma and Olivia that he would treasure for the rest of his life. It contained a photo from 20 years earlier, Marcus exhausted and overwhelmed, holding 2 tiny babies in the hospital, and a current photo of the 3 of them at the foundation gala, all dressed up and smiling. The card read, 20 years ago you chose us. Every day since, you've chosen us again. Thank you for showing us that family is built on love, sacrifice, and showing up. Thank you for being the father we needed, wanted, and deserved. Thank you for never giving up, even when the world gave you every reason to quit. We are who we are because of you. Happy Father's Day to the best dad in the world." Marcus placed the card on his mantle, next to 20 years of photos documenting a family that shouldn't have worked according to conventional wisdom, but had thrived because of unconventional love. As Marcus looked at those photos, at the visual timeline of two tiny babies becoming strong women, he thought about Rebecca Hartwell and that day in the mall that had set so many things in motion. He'd heard through the grapevine that she and James had divorced, that she'd moved away from Atlanta, that the incident had forced her to confront biases she'd never acknowledged before. He hoped she'd learned something, hoped she'd become better, but her growth wasn't his responsibility. His responsibility had been to two little girls who needed him, and he'd fulfilled that responsibility beyond his wildest dreams. They'd needed a father and he'd become one. They'd needed stability and he'd provided it. They'd needed someone to believe in them when the world saw only obstacles, and he'd never stopped believing, not for a single moment. In return, they'd given him purpose, pride, and a love so profound it had transformed him from a single man into a family. Now, surrounded by evidence of their shared journey, Marcus Williams finally allowed himself to feel what he'd been too busy and too focused to feel for 20 years. Pride, not just in his daughters but in himself for having the courage to fight for them. Satisfaction, knowing he'd made a difference not just in Emma and Olivia's lives, but in the lives of the families their foundation would help. Peace, the deep soul-level peace that comes from knowing you've lived your values, that you've taken the hard right path instead of the easy wrong one. And gratitude, overwhelming gratitude for two premature babies who'd survived against odds, for the chance to be their father, for every sleepless night and worried moment and proud achievement of the past 2 decades. He'd been judged for adopting them, criticized and questioned and doubted, but those judgments had been proven spectacularly wrong. The only judgment that mattered now was history's judgment, and history would record that Marcus Williams had loved two little girls who needed him, had raised them to be extraordinary women, and had changed the world by changing their world first.